Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. We've got a little bit of a different one teed up for you here next. We've got Dr. Jaborek from Michigan State University, and we're going to be reviewing his talk titled, "What's Different When Feeding and Managing Dairy Beef Crosses?" Jared, before we get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and understand you're at Michigan State right now, and just kind of tell us background, where'd you come from, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so as I was discussing with you guys a little while ago, I'm originally from Wisconsin, grew up with a little bit of a dairy background from my grandparents' folks and beef cattle on my parents' farm, and did my undergrad at UW River Falls there in Wisconsin, and then got a little dabble into the research side of things there while I was finishing up, and that kind of led me on to pursue a master's degree at Ohio State. I guess I enjoyed it so much I stuck around for a PhD as well. So initially was supposed to be doing some beef on dairy research. That's kind of what drew me to Ohio State. Unfortunately, they tricked me a little bit. We didn't start doing beef on dairy that first year. I guess someone forgot to breed some cows, so I ended up doing some sheep research, which that was quite the learning experience for myself, but great anyways. And then we finally got started with some of that beef on dairy research and did a little bit of marbling research. And then, yeah, I've been at Michigan State since I graduated.
Right, good, excellent. Were you there at all with Dr. Felix?
No crossover, but
okay.
We came from the same, we like to say, research lineage, so a lot of history there, and we stay in constant communication, so we kind of know what each other's doing.
Yeah, we did a podcast with her a while back. She's really cool. Really like her a lot. Yeah, good. Matt, going to be our co-host today. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I understand you work for Balchem.
I certainly do, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. It only took me 5 years to get on the podcast, so thank you. I appreciate it. So
You're persistent.
Yes, absolutely. I am the Eastern U.S. business manager for Balchem. I support a team of folks across the Eastern United States, and I've been with Balchem, as I mentioned, for 5 years. Prior to that, I've been working in industry. I did nutrition work for a feed company based out of Minnesota for several years. Did vitamin nutrition work in between there and then. I actually was a graduate of the University of Minnesota, so I'm a lowly gopher over here, I guess. But I've got a pretty big passion for the beef industry. So outside of Balchem, I actually have a small beef seed stock operation. My family and I do that, and we sell some registered cattle. Being a part of this today, it's kind of going to be fun to visit a little bit and talk about impacts on beef on dairy crossing, and there's definitely some great crossover, I think.
Good. Glad to have you here, Matt. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Looking forward to the conversation. We've got two co-hosts today. First, we'll go to Dr. Kirby Krogstad, Ohio State again. We've got 4 people that's got an Ohio State background. I get to mention that once per podcast. So
when the Buckeyes show up, we show up in mass.
We do. Well, we got to protect each other. Anyway, Kirby, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I've been a professor at Ohio State now for just a little over a year. I started in Worcester last January. I did my PhD work at Michigan State with Dr. Bradford and was in Nebraska before that with Dr. Kononov. And I've really enjoyed settling into Buckeye country. I've adjusted to the OHIO chant when it comes up, so I don't mess that up anymore. It took me a while to get go green, go white too. So I adjusted and settled into that now. But no, I focus on dairy nutrition and dairy health research. And if I'm not researching in the lab, I'm probably at home eating pizza, drinking wine with my wife.
Yeah,
so.
Awesome. Sounds good. And Bill, I guess you need no introduction, but go ahead and tell us about yourself.
First of all, it's the Ohio State University.
I was waiting for that. So.
I have to tell you, that almost costed me my PhD, is that 3-letter word, because I forgot to put it on the title page, and they wouldn't accept my thesis.
Is that right?
That's the truth.
Oh, my goodness. When I was there, the wasn't a thing.
It was when I was there. But I worked for the Ohio State for about 35 years in dairy nutrition, retired a few years ago, and now starting to enjoy retirement more and more every year.
Yeah, good. Well, it's good to have you back. Jared, why don't you you're going to be giving a presentation here this week. We're at the Tri-State Nutrition Conference. Kind of give us, what are some of the key pillars of the conversation or the presentation you're going to give today? The economics of feeding Reassure precision release choline. Reassure is fed during the transition period, and because it's fed for such a short period of time, it costs just $15 per cow. And yet the benefits will continue to generate income throughout the year. Cows fed Reassure produce 5 pounds more colostrum, which pays for your Reassure investment on the very first day of lactation. Cows fed Reassure also produce 5 pounds more milk per day, every day. That means after the first day, every day is payday. Invest in Reassure during the transition period and recoup your investment on the very first day of lactation. After that, you got it, payday.
Yeah, so like you said, I was asked to kind of talk about what's different with feeding beef on dairy crosses, which I think is interesting. We're still kind of figuring all that out. I guess if I started the presentation and said maybe it's not all that different than we think. I mean, we got beef cattle, we got dairy cattle. It's maybe somewhere in between. We're still kind of figuring out where that lies in different aspects, but just kind of talk about the adoption, how we've seen it change. I'd say it's really changed or started to come on probably since 2017. Sure, there's people doing it before then, but it's really taken off since then. So kind of go through that. We'll talk a little bit about a couple different practices, sire selection, just some introductory type stuff, and then kind of going to get into a little bit of the work that we've been doing at Michigan State in terms of research. Some of it's kind of your basic, how are those cattle comparing to what we know? So Holstein steers, we haven't done any, haven't been able to publish any data yet comparing them to beef steers, but we're currently feeding a group of those cattle right now. So maybe by the end of this year or next year, we'll have a publication on that. But kind of seeing where these cattle stack up. We know that it takes a little while for you to produce cattle. I mean, you pick out the bull, you breed the cow, you got to feed that animal, and dairy genetics, they're not the fastest maturing as we know in the beef cattle realm. So those cattle are on feed for a while. So it takes a while to get the final product and get all that data analyzed. So we've seen the genetics change quite a bit since 2017 as well, the quality of genetics that are being used. And so it's kind of been changing, but we're learning a lot. So we'll talk a little bit about performance and feeding those cattle. Liver abscesses has been a big issue. So we're studying that at the same time. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then maybe one of the biggest things, that affects the value of cattle is how much product do you get back at the end of the day. So talking about retail yield a little bit. There's not a lot of data out on it. Again, one of the main goals of the current group of cattle we have on feed, the current study that we're doing is we'll do a cutout on some of those cattle. We know the yield grade equation that we have currently doesn't do the best job at estimating yield. So let's actually separate all those different tissues between your meat, your red meat, your fat, and your bone, and see what are we actually taking home at the end of the day, and where do these cattle fall in terms of value that we get to take back. So yeah, that's kind of the gist. They only give me 30 minutes, and I suppose I could probably talk an
You're going to
hour
cover a lot in 30 minutes.
In each of those projects, I could probably talk an hour. When you get the chance to talk about something you're passionate about, you can talk forever. So that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot
You'll
you're going to cover.
You'll be sprinting to the finish on that one, won't you? Yeah.
Exactly.
It might be, yeah.
So I'm going to start with genetics. I find it interesting, and the fact that it's changed. I understand that when it first came out, they were breeding them to whatever they had because there was a shortage of beef semen. And then, has the changes been intentional by the bull studs? And if so, what exactly are they looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question. it has changed. Initially, I would say the quality wasn't so great when they started out. The cattle would come out. Basically, people were calling them black Holsteins. I mean, they got the black hide on them. They got 50% beef genetics, but it was probably our lower beef genetics. I mean, maybe that beef cattle producers wouldn't even want to use, right? So, um, left a lot to be desired. So, I think the semen companies really stepped up, started developing indexes and selection criteria, and I would say some of those companies all have a different perspective on what to look for. Um, so yeah, they probably have different inputs on breed type as well. I guess some of what we're seeing is some of the you got to think about economic traits that are going to be important for you. You have to produce a live calf. I mean, if you have calving problems that affects the dairy, that's not going to help them make money, obviously, right? And you need that live calf so that you can feed it. So calving ease is important at some point. You don't want to compromise it that way. Growth. We get paid in pounds. So you got to pay for an animal to take up space in your feedlot. Those are days that you're constantly feeding that animal. So if you can increase growth rate, minimize days on feed, that lowers your input cost. So I encourage growth. And then in terms of muscling, that's another thing. Looking at ribeye area is one of the EPDs that you're selecting for. Dairy cattle are selected for milk production. They're not selected for red meat yield like the beef cattle are. So,
Yeah, that ribeye looks a little different.
oh, yes, it does. Yes. We were just ultrasounding cattle 2 weeks ago for our research project, and the Holsteins are far behind. But yeah, so you got to increase muscle mass in those cattle. So making sure that that's a priority in your selection criteria. And then we're chasing quality grades, marbling in our industry. The consumer wants a high quality beef product. They're willing to pay for it. So it's our job to make sure that we don't compromise that. Dairy cattle actually contribute one of the larger percentages or towards prime quality grades or our superior quality grades. So we like what we see with those dairy genetics, but we don't want the beef side to hold that back in any way. So still making sure that you're keeping that in mind. You can select high marbling bulls as well. So that's kind of where I go for trait selection, I guess. There were some concerns about frame, I think, earlier on, but what we've seen is that the beef genetics have actually moderated frame compared to those Holstein genetics. And then obviously, if you're working on the Jersey side, those frame genetics are pretty small to begin with. In terms of breed, we haven't messed around too much with breed personally. I guess when I was doing some of my beef on Jersey research at the Ohio State, we looked at a few different breeds there, and there's not a whole lot of differences. There's some nuances here and there. And then you mentioned Dr. Tara Felix at Penn State. They've done some more in-depth research looking at different sire breeds. And again, I think a lot of those, there's smaller nuances there, but for the most part, a lot of similarities. I think mostly the message I try to say is, everyone's got their favorite breed that they like to raise and they'll promote. But sometimes you need to just select the best bulls within breed or for the best traits. And we had the Meat Animal Research Center, they publish a crossbreed EPD. So you can compare sires across breeds and say, okay, these are the best ones for growth, best muscling, best marbling. Why not take those? And there probably is influence on breed. Continental breeds are going to carry a little bit more muscle compared to maybe your British or your earlier maturing breeds, right? So maybe there's some influence there, but for the most part, I mean, if you just select good sires based on their EPDs and those traits, I think you'll have great success.
Yeah. Kind of want to circle back real quick, and then I'll turn it over to the panels. But you talked about calving ease, and I'm just kind of curious. Your talk's titled "What's Different." Do you see differences between the beef studs and the Holstein studs? And if so, what is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I had this conversation with some friends last night as we were talking about beef on dairy, and I don't know that I have enough information to make many claims on that. I think we see that the dam can dictate the size of that calf, and a large way. I mean, you look at the difference between a Jersey cow and a Holstein cow; those calves come out very different, right? So, I think the dam's pretty influential in that. But I'm not going to say too much on that, just because I don't have enough data probably to back up any claims on that.
Okay. Anything related to calf weight? Are they similar? No?
In terms of the beef on dairy
Yeah.
versus the Holsteins,
Holsteins, yeah.
I think they're probably very similar. They're both coming from that Holstein cow. I think that dam probably has the greatest influence from what I've seen. Now there is going to be some variation with sire. I think that goes across that, but again, I probably can't speak too much to that.
Yeah. You guys have been far too polite. You need to elbow your way in here.
When you sit next to Bill, I don't want to step on any toes here.
I guess I'll just start at the beginning. Milk replacers. There are different protocols if you're raising a beef calf compared to a heifer.
It's a good question. There has been a little research that's just come out looking at. So one of the things is, I mean, there's not a lot of published research out yet on these beef on dairy calves, and if there is, you can maybe find it in someone's thesis, and it's not quite there in the journal article yet. So there has been a little bit of research looking at that. I wouldn't say that anything out of the ordinary stands out that you need to do it one way or another. These calves do have the propensity to grow. From what I've seen early on, they start to surpass those straight bred dairy counterparts. So do they have the propensity to eat a little bit more? Not sure. I've seen some data where their intake is actually a little less than the straight bred dairy calves, and they still grow just as well. So they're a little bit more feed efficient. So I'm not quite sure yet. I think we need a lot more research on it. I still think it's quite new that we don't know everything yet.
Well, I think it's an interesting question because you talk like liver abscesses came up as a concern that people have had. And one of the master's students yesterday gave a presentation about calf health outcomes for non-replacement heifers and bull calves, and there's such a wide variation in health status of those calves that are not being being fed or raised to replace the lactating animals. So I think that is a compelling question because we haven't addressed how raising those young dairy beef calves will influence, liver abscess and rumen health and their growth later on in that stage of life. So I think it's something that maybe the dairy industry is working towards, is the standards for raising those compared to raising a replacement heifer are kind of merging. I think they're coming together.
Yeah, I mean, from my background previously, I didn't have a lot of calf raising experience, so I kind of tried to dive into that a little bit, review that a little bit while I've been at Michigan State just to learn more on my own. And one of the things I quickly noticed is that we have a big knowledge gap in calf research and how it affects the subsequent life and performance of those cattle raised for beef. You have a lot of research on those bull calves for past weaning, let's say.
60 days, 70 days.
And well, they could maybe apply it to the heifer calf or something like that. But a lot of those were terminal studies, or they never followed those cattle through. And we don't know how those treatments affect those cattle later on in life. So I think that's a huge gap. Missed opportunity that maybe we didn't know was going to be a big question for us in the future. But so I think there's a lot of research that can be done in that area, certainly.
So I don't know anything about beef. Are these,
You like beef?
Oh yeah, it's very much so. I do
know a lot
how to
about
eat it.
steak, right? Yeah.
But are these dairy crosses more likely to get abscesses, or is it? Do you think it's genetics, or is it the way they're raised, or?
It's a good question. So oftentimes people want to make the genetic claim, but I think it's often confounded by previous experience, how they're raised. From what we see, typically the straight bred dairy or the Holsteins, they have more liver abscesses than the crosses. The crosses would be intermediate to the straight beef. So that's typically what we see. But again, those production systems that those cattle are raised in are so different. Where you got the straight bred or the beef calf coming off pasture, they're typically weaned 7 to 8 months of age, versus these calves coming from the dairy that they have 6, 8 weeks and they're weaned, right? And So the other thing is too is their exposure to concentrate feeds or high energy feeds. We got these calves coming from the dairy system that are on high energy feeds, very little forage, trying to promote rapid growth, rapid average daily gain, and they have a lot of days on feed on those diets compared to, say, your beef steers that you're raising. So, and the other trend is too, we're feeding cattle longer than we have in the past. We're achieving higher final weights or hot carcass weights, and we're trying to get more marbling in those cattle. So I think that compounds the issue that we have more days on feed for those cattle, and it's leading to more abscesses, and that's why we're starting to see that more than, or at least we're recognizing it more as a problem than we have in the past. Not that they never had abscesses in the past, but yeah.
So for my edification, again, I'm a dairy guy. What are the, in addition to animal welfare issues, what's the problems with abscesses? What do you see?
Yeah, great question. So obviously it's a big problem in the plant. So there's not really any discounts or anything applied to the producer when they sell cattle, but that liver would be a byproduct that the packer could sell. So again, if it's condemned for whatever reason, if it's abscesses or whatever it may be, that's a lost value that they can't sell. The other thing is with abscesses, depending on how severe they are, that can make a mess. And let's say it was an open abscess, you cut that open and it gets on the carcass, that requires trimming. So that's a loss of product. That slows down line speed in some of these big plants. So those things all affect a cost and the final value, right? So those are the biggest ones that I think you can recognize. The other ones that are maybe a little bit more hidden are how's that actually affecting performance? And I've kind of tried to tease that out of some of our data a little bit. And what we're seeing is, on average, it seems like it's about 0.2 of a pound reduction in average daily gain for severe abscesses. So we have I guess I should say there's a liver abscess scoring system that's widely used where a 0 would be a clean liver, no abscesses. You have less severe, so let's say an A minus or A, so where you have 1 or 2 or they're small abscesses, versus an A plus, which would be you have multiple. You have, let's say, over 4 small abscesses, or you have a really big abscess, or these abscesses can even adhere to, say, the diaphragm. And in those cases where we have the really severe abscesses, that's where we're seeing the reduction. So, but we've seen it can be anywhere from 1/10 to 3/10 of a pound. So you think about that over a long feeding period, that adds up. That's dollars in the producer's pocket. Because I often get questions, I mean, being extension, talking with producers about this data, they're like, well, how does this affect me? Well, this is affecting how your cattle are growing for you, how many days you need to feed those cattle. So I haven't been able to look at feed efficient data because we have pen studies, so I can't tease that out, but I imagine that affects feed efficiency too. I mean, it's an infection, so we know that you need energy to fight an infection, right? So, yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, the point you make about the raising, the systems of those calves being raised on, say, 7, 8 months out on pasture with mom and suckling versus getting a texturized starter and increasing milk allowance generally for dairy calves, maybe 4 liters twice a day, 5 liters twice a day. So the carbohydrates that rumen is seeing early in life are dramatically different. And so I do wonder what the rumen development might look at on the water-soluble carbohydrates from pasture versus the starch and resistant starch in a calf starter. That's kind of intriguing. Do you have any thoughts on how you think that might affect that rumen?
I think it'd be something that'd be great to
Probably
look
another thesis, right? A master student thesis or
I think
something.
it could keep somebody really busy. Yeah. Yeah.
Fair point.
You could probably get a few students out of that. Yeah. It's an interesting question. A lot of unknowns.
Yeah. I was wondering too about supply chain. So we're kind of back to the genetics thing a little bit. So the supply chain that producer is in, is that really impacting that breeding decision or the breed they're choosing to breed their cattle to? From my experience, Angus is the primary one that I see producers using, and at least that's what my family used growing up. We were breeding dairy beef back in 2012, 2013. And it was always Angus or Sim Angus or something. So I didn't know, does that supply chain matter? Do those end buyers have a preference, or those packers have a preference?
They prefer probably whatever makes them the most money.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So, I mean, at the end of the day, you can't see hide color, but we have certified Angus beef as a huge player. I mean, you can get a premium for that, right? So hide color was very instrumental. We have a lot of black cattle, right, that can achieve those that certified Angus beef label. So a lot of people, I think, try to at least produce a black calf that gives that calf an opportunity. Now, there's a lot of other criteria besides being black that calf or steer would have to meet in order to get that label claim. I think that's where you see the influence there. Angus is by far one of the most popular. I'll have a slide later that kind of shows units of semen for each of those breeds, and you'll see Angus is by far the most popular, and then Simmental, and then you got some of the other ones too. But again, those are cattle that can be black, right? So I think that's kind of the influence you see there.
What kind of differences are we seeing in growth in that early life, right? We talked about differences. Beef cattle are on forage and milk. You know, dairy cattle are on grain and milk and a little bit of forage. How does that play out in terms of performance and growth?
Yeah, there's a really neat study by Furness and others. I believe I'll say Texas. I think it's out of Texas Tech, where they compared, they had Angus sired beef calves that got to be raised on pasture with their dams, so your beef production system, and then they had Angus sired embryos that got placed into Holstein dams or Jersey dams, and then they had those same Angus bulls being crossbred to a Holstein or a Jersey. So they had the cross, they had embryo, they're basically straight beef calves raised in the dairy production system, and then you had the beef calves raised in the beef production system. And early life growth, they saw those beef calves raised on pasture with their dams. They started to separate themselves very early already compared to those calves raised in that dairy production system. And I think that's eye-opening right there to tell people that those systems are very impactful and will cause those calves to grow differently early on. And some of those cross calves, they kept up for a little bit, but then they started to separate themselves. Particularly the Angus Jersey started to fall behind and kind of remained behind the remainder of that finishing period. The Angus Holsteins, they have pretty good growth. I mean, that's still a larger animal, so they were keeping up fairly well from what I recall from that study. So that's kind of what they're seeing in terms of early life between those two different systems that you were asking about.
Can you speculate why? Why is those beef calves on the dam doing better? More milk?
Well, we know that milk composition is different. There was a study, and now I'm trying to remember who it was by. I want to say maybe Carter and others. But they looked at, again, we had a question about some of the milk replacers earlier, and they were trying to imitate a milk replacer that would be more similar to beef cow's milk in composition versus dairy cow's milk in composition. And I think that could be it. I mean, there's a nutritional composition there. And then again, how much are we feeding that calf? I mean, beef calf has free access. They're eating as much as they want, long as that cow can produce it, versus we have those calves on the dairy system. They're on some kind of schedule that they get this much, and maybe it's always that much. Maybe they don't even get stepped up as they're growing. So I think those are some of the limitations that can potentially cause some of those differences. I suppose it'd be pretty interesting to look at how those calves respond in a study where they have greater access. Maybe they get a free choice milk in some of those automated milk feeding systems.
Well, that was going to be my next question. How do you try to simulate that at the dairy?
That would be, my guess is.
Yeah, kind of goes back to the research that's needed, Kirby.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that a hint, Scott?
Maybe.
Yeah, I think as we get some more research, maybe we can learn from, say, a study that had automated milk feeding system and see, okay, where are these calves at? And maybe we can program something for producers and say, here's kind of the steps or the progression you need through that calf's lifetime, or as they grow in size, maybe this is how much milk you need to be delivering those calves to maximize growth potential for them.
Well, and in some of those robot systems, calves are getting 10, 12, 14 liters of milk a day. If you'd have told my grandpa that back in the 80s, that we're giving calves 12 liters a day, he would have walked off the farm and said, I'm done with this business.
So I'm curious. One comment you made is that the composition of beef milk is different than dairy milk. Do you know what those differences are?
Ooh,
No.
put me on the spot. I
Yeah.
can't say that I remember those numbers off the top of my head.
And dairy composition's changing rapidly. So is it going to catch up or is
Yeah.
it getting behind? I
Yeah,
don't know.
I don't know, and I'm trying to remember if I jotted down some of those differences in my conference paper or not. But yeah, there's people looking into that. So
Yeah, good. It's
hopefully
going to
we'll
keep you
have-
guys employed for a while.
yeah, hopefully we'll have someone will look into that and get us some answers on that.
Yeah.
So after these guys are weaned in a little bit, how do you feed these guys? Do they just start on the feedlot diet right away, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, what's different between feeding them? I would say we don't know. They're still fed like a Holstein would be fed. I mean, that's what we know. They're raised up from that system. There's a lot of similarities, so they've been fed that way. And cattle feeding's regional. I mean, it differs by region. Available feedstuffs, such of that. In our area, there's a lot of guys, a lot of calf raisers that like to feed, say, whole shell corn in a pellet, for instance, and maybe there's a little free choice of hay somewhere, or they're eating straw bedding or something like that. But it's a high concentrate diet from the get-go. Once they get them transferred over, whatever starter they had them on, maybe they're stepping down protein as those calves are growing, but yeah, right away. So really there's very little transition, I suppose, from those calf raising diets or those starter diets to a finishing diet. I mean, you already had them on a really high energy diet, and you're just maintaining that. Now, my personal opinion, I don't think that's really sustainable. I think that's where we're running into those liver abscess and those digestive health problems with these cattle.
Is there anybody looked at maybe growing them up a bit and then throw them back on pasture? Like, I don't know the term for beef, but I think backgrounding or whatever.
Backgrounding,
But
yeah,
put-
yeah, absolutely.
Backgrounding or stockers, yeah. And there's people that used to do that from Holsteins. I mean, they try to get some cheap gains on them, get a little age on them, and then bring them in the feedlot as what people like to call yearlings. And I believe there was some work maybe done. There's a grad student doing some of that stuff at Oklahoma State, I believe. So we'll see more what those. Like I said, there's a lot of new research coming out. It's maybe not quite published, but we'll see what those results are like. I imagine somebody's going to at least look at it. Yeah, good question though.
I was curious with some of as these critters hit the feedlot between the a straight bred beef animal and a dairy beef cross. Are the feedlot nutritionists making any sort of cowboy adjustments, so to speak, on like any G numbers on their ration simulations, or they're like, oh, dairy beef they discount 5% or add 5%. Are they? Is there any of that math going on?
There's some people. I actually saw a poster at Plains Nutritional Conference here last week. They were trying to figure out what the maintenance requirements were of some of
That
these
was my next
crosses.
question. Yeah.
And those estimates were a lot greater than previously what had been published for Holsteins and beef steers. So it comes you almost need to have within the same experiment, you need to have those controls of breed to make fair comparisons.
Well, and some of that lines up with dairy, right? The maintenance requirement in the last NASEM bumped up a little bit, and yeah.
Yeah, and I'm trying to recall some numbers. Typically, we see that dairy genetics have a greater maintenance requirement compared to our beef, so you might expect that they're somewhere in the middle. And it depends on type probably a little bit too. I think if you're making good selection decisions, we can see that these beef crosses are maybe more similar to beef than they are Holsteins or dairy type. So that may shift. Maybe they're not exactly in the middle, right? They're maybe a little bit more like beef. So we'll see as more data comes out. But yeah.
I had another off-the-wall question I was thinking about as we're sitting here. Is a beef cross calf right now for a dairy is what, $1,100 or something, leaving the farm, or $1,000?
Yeah,
Does
something
it
like
make
that.
more economic sense to do the crossbreeding, or is it even better to do a beef embryo?
That's a good question. I'm not too familiar on how much it's going to cost to do beef embryos. I think some people would encourage that practice right away. Then I guess you're cutting out the dairy genetics entirely, and you just have another beef animal. again, from what we talked about, you probably still have a reduction in performance just because of the production system that they're raised in, compared to the beef animal that's raised in the beef production system. But
And how much more could you afford to pay for a purebred beef calf? I
Yeah.
mean, $1,100, that's a lot.
Well, the percent of someone had told me the number, but the percent of the income for 1,000 cow dairy that's selling these cross calves, like getting to be 10, 15, 18% of their income every month, and I mean, that's a big number.
yeah, it's another enterprise for them, or at least income source, and so you can't blame them for doing it. Yeah, we'll see how the market changes. And markets are always changing. I mean, right now we're at a lull in the cattle cycle, beef cattle cycle. So there's a demand for cattle. I mean, we're in short supply. So
Demand for heifers too, in some cases, yeah.
yeah, so we'll see how I imagine maybe the beef on dairy breeding might take a little step back because of the shortage in replacement
Yeah,
heifers.
probably.
But I think it's still here to stay. I think
Oh,
it's,
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, that's a income source for those dairies. Um, Trying to remember the rest of your question there.
No, I think pretty much addressed
Yeah.
it. I didn't expect a concrete answer, but it's one I think about because the market as it sits with a glut of heifers and a glut of animals, they're all high value. So almost all of them make sense to feed at this moment, whether it's a dairy heifer, a dairy beef cross, right? You can sell a Springer or you can sell a fresh cow for $4,200, or you can sell a beef calf for $1,100. It all sounds pretty darn good from an economic perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Question for you is, have you seen more retention? Maybe a dairy producer is, electing to hold on to that animal and retain ownership and feed that animal longer, or just take the money and run, right? I guess the question I've got for you is, I mean, it's $1,100 check, day 1, 2, 3 of life, right? What if they could really capitalize if they've got the space in the facilities? Do you think they'd evaluate doing that, or what's your kind of take on that?
Yeah.
What have you seen?
I think you bring up a couple different great points there. It really depends on their situation, what they have available. Again, you can sell that calf, cut yourself a check right now, rid yourself of all the risk. Now, on the other hand, if you have the facilities, you have the feed, you're willing to diversify, and maybe you feed those calves until feeder size, maybe 400, 500 pounds, or maybe you want to feed them 1,000 pounds, or you're feeding them all the way through. There's the potential for profit there. Again, you need to have the infrastructure, the labor. You need to have all that in place and be willing or being able to do it. There's also a risk with that. I mean, those cattle have to survive for you too. So, but there is the potential to make money on them. Again, just a lot of dairies they're in the milk business. They're not in the beef business. So that would just require them to diversify. Maybe they need to put up another barn to handle those calves. I mean, they just don't have the infrastructure to do it for most of them. But in some cases, they are.
I
Just
guess I would
depends.
challenge that statement just a little bit, because at the end of the day, all dairymen are in the beef business, because you do something with the call cow at the end of the day,
Yeah.
right?
They're, you're eating them one way or the other.
That's right.
Yes, that is very true. I'll say the mentality from
Yes.
most of them is only in the milk business. But as Kirby was saying, right now that calf is such a large portion of their income source. Yeah, but yeah, they've always been in the beef business, whether they want to acknowledge it or
Absolutely.
not. Yes,
I had a bit
yes.
of a follow-up, if I may, on the raising them themselves. And the question, so I've been doing a lot of writing and thinking about starch and starch source and starch fermentability. And on a dairy farm, dry ground corn is kind of the bread and butter. A few folks will do high moisture. So when you're feeding out the dairy beef crosses and beef cattle, is it flaked corn most predominant, cracked corn? Like, what's the grain source? So if a dairy was going to say raise both, their dry ground corn's going to the lactating barn, what's the other starch source they need to have on site?
Corn processing really varies by region. Down south, or at least on some of the bigger feedlots, they can afford to steam flake their corn. A lot of smaller farms or farmer feeder type operations don't have the infrastructure, can't pay for that, so they're resorting to something else. You got a lot of dry rolled corn. Over in Michigan, where I'm at, a lot of high moisture corn being fed. So that's what we've been feeding through our feedlot. They've fed in the past. They store it that way. One of my interests is actually looking at corn processing a little bit more in depth and seeing how how that affects these liver abscesses, because much to your point, we know that it affects the rate of fermentation, where that starch is being digested, how that affects gut health in terms of rumen pH, and ultimately leading to liver abscesses potentially. So I think we'll hopefully learn a little bit more on that. I think we may need to be a little wiser on spreading out starch digestion through the digestive tract instead of overwhelming one area potentially. Yeah, and the other thing that comes down to it is fiber inclusion, effective fiber inclusion. One of the studies we talk about today, we fed different corn silage levels, and it made a night and day difference in reducing liver abscesses. I mean, one of the things people are often chasing the most efficient or optimal performance of chasing the best gains because they can save some dollars that way. I mean, it's efficient production for them, but at what point are you sacrificing too much health?
Pound or two of roughage might go a long way.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. I would say a lot of people say push those Holsteins as hard as you can in terms of the feedlot so you don't get too much frame on them or they don't get too growthy or eat you out of house and home. But from what I'm seeing, or at least what we saw in this study that we just finished up, those cattle will eat, but they're a little less feed efficient, but they'll eat a little bit more to reach the same gain. And at the end of the day, our cost of gain was no different between the high corn silage and low corn silage diets, but we improved liver abscess reduction by 30 percentage units. So it was really influential. So I think it's a balance. It probably always has been a balance. So long as you're not chasing the production side too much and you focus a little bit on the health side, you can have a happy medium, I think.
Jared, you said in the beginning when you gave us the overview, you're going to talk a little bit about retail yield. I'm kind of curious also about quality. I don't know if you're going to address that or not, but let's say Bill goes to the restaurant tonight and he orders a nice prime steak.
Yeah, big spender.
Is he gonna know whether or not that's a beef dairy cross or a beef cross by the way it looks, the way it marbles?
That's a good question. So typically our dairy genetics, let's say Holstein Jerseys, they have a flatter ribeye or let's say loin. So you got your ribeye, you got your strip steak all coming from that loin. Typically on the dairy animals, it's a little flatter, sometimes a little longer. We don't see a big difference in weight usually, at least in some of the Jersey crossbred research I had done at the Ohio State, no difference. So I think they did some of that retail work, might have been Texas Tech or Texas A&M on some of these beef dairy crosses and some similar relationships or findings, I guess, with that as well. But typically they have a flatter shape. Some people say it's more angular or triangular in shape versus that round appearance. So I suppose you could pick it out that way. I think some of the packers try to mold that shape a little bit too, I think, influence it that way. So if you had the straight dairy versus straight beef, I suppose you're really picking it out. I think with the genetics, as we select for more muscling in these beef dairy crosses, I think it's definitely shifted the shape more towards the beef side. So you probably wouldn't be able to pick that out per se in terms of shape or appearance. In terms of quality grade, again, like I said, those dairy genetics they're known for marbling. They make up some of the higher quality grades or contribute to them and have in the past. And from what we're seeing from the beef dairy crosses, they're marbling just as well. So they're maintaining that. So I expect that we're not really hurting our marbling scores there. So, yeah.
Good. Any other big questions, guys?
I just got one. You said many times we don't know. We need research. Research resources will always be limited. So if you had to pick just one research question, what's the most important research question you think needs answering?
I don't want to give away all my good ideas.
Okay, so
What's the second most important one?
Well, like I said, I guess we've kind of been dabbling in the forage inclusion with the corn silage. I think that's an important topic, and I guess, like I said, my next step, I'd like to see how that pairs with corn processing a little bit too. Nebraska's done some great stuff in both those areas that I've seen, but it's been a while since we've really done a full evaluation on corn processing, and there's a lot of work being, relating both those to gut health. I think that's been the hot topic area, and I guess that's kind of where I've been dabbling too. I think we kind of have to understand how to feed cattle. I mean, there's so many different ways to do it, and some people have success doing it one way or another, and some people just don't have any success, or I mean, they have the problems and they ignore them, I guess, and just assume, yep, I'm doing a great job. So, I think those are. I mean, we can get back to some of the basics, I think, and figure out where we need to be at.
Yeah. It's been a great discussion, Jared. I appreciate you joining us here today. What I'd like to do as we wrap up is just kind of come up with a couple key takeaways that you'd like to share with the audience, and give you guys just a second to think about that. And I'm going to start with Bill. He's pretty quick with some wrap-up answers.
Our last call question is sponsored by AminoSure XM Precision Release Methionine, the next generation in amino acid balancing. With AminoSure XM, you can save up to 5 cents per cow per day on your methionine investment. Try it today and receive an additional 2.5 cents per cow per day savings with Balchem's limited time rebate offer. Contact your Balchem representative to learn more.
Well, I learned a lot because this is something I took my beef nutrition course at Purdue about 50 years ago. So I think there's a lot to learn, but I think, the potential is an income stream. We've got to learn how to do this correctly, both for the good of the animal and profitability. So I think there's just a whole lot we don't know. And I guess, do we extrapolate the dairy growth data since we don't know, or the beef growth data? And I don't know and how to feed these things. So I think one thing I learned is there's a lot we don't know, much more we don't know.
Which honestly has got to be exciting as a researcher,
Yeah.
right? Or a
Yeah.
young researcher,
Exactly,
Bill. You're
exactly.
probably not gonna,
Yeah, I'm not doing the research.
You're not coming out of retirement anytime soon. All right, very well. We're good with that. Kirby, any final thoughts, takeaways for you?
Yeah, I think discussions like this are always exciting to dive into the nuances that exist between breeds or between management systems or whatever it might be. But I always kind of leave with the thought that it really comes down to the fundamental things that we try to do every day. And if you're doing those things right, like in a feedlot scenario, maybe it is just a little pound or two of roughage, take care of some of these problems, might take care of 90% of the issues. And then the other one for me is when it comes to these calves, especially from a dairy perspective, if you've got a big dairy and you got a lot of beef cross calves, I don't think it's a wise choice to shortchange those calves. I think we want to make sure that they're getting the same high quality colostrum, and if they need it, maybe some electrolytes. And I think we want to put those animals or treat those animals like we would our replacement heifers, because I think that'll pay off in the long term, especially if you're doing it within your own production setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Matt?
Yeah, I think one key takeaway is, we're really at the forefront of all this still. I mean, after many years of beef on dairy crossing here, and and it's more than just the black cheap bull that we got out of the tank, right? I think we're really making strides and improvements in terms of genetics that are going to influence yield and performance. But still offer a low birth weight or a moderate birth weight calf, right? So it's really exciting to see this kind of continuing to develop and grow, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how we can maybe, as an industry, we don't just look at the semen costs in the front end. What can we do to really think about? Yeah, the semen cost is there, but there's something on the back end that we can profit from, right, by improving performance and quality and yield.
Yeah, good comments. Jared, this has got to be an exciting time for people like yourself. There's so much we don't know. It looks like an opportunity to me for the dairy people to learn from the beef people, and the beef people to learn from the dairy people, and learn things, because there's two different management practices. So you're kind of in a sweet spot of research, I think, for a dairy researcher. Couple comments from you as you want to wrap this up.
Yeah, I think those were great summary statements or takeaways, guys. The other thing, like I said, I think there's a big knowledge gap between that early life management and how that affects that animal later on, and there's so much potential to learn from that. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of early life interventions folks try to apply and see how that affects future performance of that animal.
Yep, for sure. Jared, thank you for joining us today. Matt, first time. Let's not wait 5 years till you come back.
He's
Bill.
a gopher, so wait 2 or 3. Yeah. That's right.
Bill, it's always a joy to have you. And Kirby, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you, and I think maybe tomorrow you're going to see you again.
I believe so.
All right, good. Thanks you guys for joining us. This has been great. To our audience out there, thank you for coming along with us on another episode of the Real Science Exchange. I hope you learned something. I hope you had some fun. Hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.